It did not begin with bombs, it began with silence. When NATO warplanes roared across the skies of Libya in 2011, the world cheered for what it called a humanitarian intervention. But for millions of Africans, it was not salvation, it was a funeral. That night marked the moment when the dream of an independent Africa was buried beneath the engines of foreign powers. In the months before the airstrikes began, African leaders had pleaded for dialogue. They begged to mediate, to speak with Muammar Gaddafi before chaos erupted, but their voices were pushed aside. Then came a cold, final message from the West. If you fly into Libyan airspace, we cannot guarantee your safety. That sentence did more than keep a few planes grounded. It buried the pride of an entire continent. Gaddafi fell, Libya burned, and the African Union, the body once envisioned as the shield of the continent, stood powerless, observing, waiting, paralyzed by fear and by meaningless diplomacy. When the dust settled, Africa was left with ruins and questions. The man who once dreamed of a United States of Africa was gone, and with him vanished the illusion that the continent could rely on the kindness of the world. In the decade that followed, the shattered remains of Libya became a monument to humiliation. Slave markets in broad daylight, warlords ruling over ashes, young men from Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso chained and sold like cattle. Since that night, one question has haunted Africa's conscience. Can we defend ourselves on our own soil, in our own name? Now, more than 10 years later, that question has returned heavy and familiar. This time, the whispers do not rise from Tripoli, but from Johannesburg. Western newspapers speak the same old word, genocide. The language of compassion, the promise of protection, the opening notes of a song Africa has heard far too many times. But something has changed. From the shadow of Libya's tragedy, a new generation is rising, a generation that remembers the silence but refuses to repeat it. They bear names like Ibrahim Traoré, they walk in the legacy of Mariam Sankara, and they carry a message the world has long ignored. Africa will no longer ask permission to exist. When the world said it was protecting Libya, Africa learned what protection truly meant. It meant bombs dressed in the robes of humanitarianism. It meant democracy delivered by drones. It meant promises of freedom paid for with a decade of chaos. Now, as whispers of genocide echo across South Africa, those memories return like ghosts. The same language of compassion has come back again, soft words hiding sharp intentions. Western journalists speak of human rights. Diplomats warn of civilians in danger. And once again, the continent feels the cold breath of intervention creeping closer. On the streets of Johannesburg, people can feel it. They see headlines written not to seek truth, but to justify action. They remember the first time the phrase humanitarian intervention became a license for destruction. They remember Libya. They remember the slave markets that rose from the rubble, the young men who vanished into the desert. And they ask themselves, will South Africa become the next stage for the same performance? Once again, the African Union remains silent. No emergency summits, no unified declarations, only the whispers of bureaucracy buried beneath the roar of foreign media. That is the same silence that once haunted Libya, the same paralysis that turned solidarity into shame. To ordinary people, the pattern is already clear. Every concern begins with sympathy and ends with soldiers. Every promise of peace carries the scent of occupation. Yesterday, it was Tripoli. Tomorrow, it could be Johannesburg or Ouagadougou. And that is why the question now resounds louder than ever. If Africa does not defend South Africa today, who will defend Burkina Faso tomorrow? This is not just about politics. It is about dignity, the right to make mistakes, to rebuild, to rise again without asking anyone's permission. Libya was the warning. South Africa is the test. And the answer will determine whether the dream of an independent Africa still lives or will die once more beneath another flag. And then, when the dust of betrayal began to settle, Africa started to hear its own heartbeat again, the faint rhythm of a continent that had once stayed silent before the suffering of its brothers. Years after the smoke over Libya faded, one voice finally broke the silence. President Yoweri Museveni of Uganda stood before the cameras and said what many other leaders would not dare to say. We failed to protect Gaddafi. It was a confession carved in guilt, an admission that Africa's pride had been traded for fear. But apologies cannot resurrect a nation. They cannot rebuild the cities that have fallen, nor restore the dignity buried beneath foreign boots. Libya was lost, and with it, the illusion of a united Africa. Museveni's words were honest, but they came too late, like a eulogy for a man who had been abandoned long before his death. Across the continent, the same haunting question echoed: if the African Union could not protect Gaddafi, can it protect anyone? Today, that question carries a new name: Ibrahim Traoré. The young captain who rose to defend Burkina Faso now stands as a symbol of defiance in a world that punishes independence. His reforms shake the old powers, his voice shatters the silence. And yet, behind closed doors, the same hesitation lingers. Would the African Union defend him if the world turned its back? Would it stand with Burkina Faso, or suspend it once again, as it did before, when the country chose its own path over Western approval? The truth is painful. Unity without courage is just an empty ritual. An organization afraid to protect its own is not a shield, it is merely its shadow. But from within that shadow, a new movement has begun to rise. It does not come from the corridors of Addis Ababa, nor from the offices of foreign embassies. It comes from the hearts of ordinary Africans, the young, the proud, the unafraid. They are the sons and daughters of those who once believed in the African dream, and they refuse to let that dream die twice. They have heard enough apologies. Now, it is time for action. But not every flame begins with youth. Some are lit by pain, sustained by memory, and it is those flames that illuminate the path for a new generation. Before Ibrahim Traoré, before the uprisings and the sanctions, there was a woman who carried the grief of an entire nation on her shoulders. Her name was Mariam Sankara, the widow of Thomas Sankara, the great revolutionary of Burkina Faso who was assassinated. For decades, she lived in silence, exiled from her homeland, watching as the ideals her husband had died defending were buried beneath corruption, coups, and compromise. Yet she never cursed, never begged, never surrendered. When the world forgot his name, she whispered it in every prayer. When men in power mocked her loyalty, she answered with dignity. And then, one October morning in the year 2022, the impossible happened. A young captain named Ibrahim Traoré stepped onto the stage and declared that Burkina Faso would never kneel again. As his words echoed across Ouagadougou, somewhere in exile, an old woman wept not out of weakness, but out of recognition. For the first time in 35 years, she heard her husband's dream spoken aloud once more. When Mariam Sankara finally returned to Burkina Faso for the official funeral of Thomas Sankara, the crowd was not silent. They chanted his name, then hers. She walked slowly through rows of red, green, and gold, flags her face carved by time, her eyes burning with the fire of unfinished revolutions. In that moment, she was not merely a widow. She was the conscience of Africa. Each step she took was a reminder of what was lost in Libya, stolen in Congo, and betrayed in Mali. And when she spoke, her voice trembled, but her words cut deep. A revolution does not die when its leader is killed. It dies only when the people forget. Her message spread like wildfire in the hearts of the young. They printed her words on T-shirts, painted them on walls, and shouted them through the streets of Dakar, Bamako, and Kinshasa. It was not nostalgia, it was a warning. Africa must remember before it repeats. From Mariam Sankara's courage, Ibrahim Traoré drew his own resolve. From her pain, he forged his patience. And from her silence, he learned that true strength does not need to shout, it endures. Everything began in silence, almost invisible, like the first winds before a storm arrives. After decades of quiet, coups, and humiliation, a new alliance rose from the heart of Africa. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, three nations once branded as unstable, now standing shoulder to shoulder under the banner of dignity. For the first time in modern African history, soldiers spoke not as mercenaries, but as patriots. They declared the creation of the Alliance of Sahel states not to conquer anyone, but to reclaim what had been stolen: sovereignty. In the capitals of the West, reactions came instantly and with fear. The same newspapers that once praised democratic transitions now screamed about anti-Western military regimes. Analysts warned of Russian influence, Chinese manipulation, and authoritarian tendencies. But on the streets of Bamako and Ouagadougou, no one cared about the headlines. For them, this was not geopolitics, this was rebirth. Women selling bread beneath red, green, and gold flags. Children writing Sahel Libre on classroom walls. Farmers praying that this time, Africa would never kneel again. Everywhere, a burning question spread. Can Africa defend itself without asking for permission? And for the first time, the answer was whispered, yes. The alliance moved quickly. They expelled foreign forces, those who had stayed too long and achieved too little. They nationalized the mines once controlled by outsiders. They turned their soldiers into builders, farmers, and teachers. What the West called rebellion, the people called rebirth. Yet the fear in Europe and Washington grew stronger. If 3 nations could resist, what would happen if 10 stood up? What if the old model of aid dependency collapsed overnight? What if Africa stopped asking and started deciding for itself? In closed rooms, Western diplomats called it a dangerous, contagious disease. But on the dusty streets of Ouagadougou, people called it hope. When Ibrahim Traoré met his allies from Mali and Niger, the cameras captured a scene unseen since the days of Thomas Sankara. No lavish suits, no pompous ceremony, only uniforms, dust, and determination. They spoke of roads connecting their 3 nations, of shared defense, of energy independence. Every word was an echo of defiance born from the ashes of Libya and the tears of Mariam Sankara. As the alliance grew stronger, so did the pressure. Sanctions, isolation, smear campaigns. But this time, everything was different. The people refused to surrender. From Dakar to Dar es Salaam, young Africans began chanting a single name, Traoré. Not as a savior, but as a mirror reflecting what they themselves could become if they dared to rise. The West once feared the return of another Gaddafi. Instead, they now faced the awakening of millions of Sankaras. Power never leaves quietly. When the Sahel alliance began to rise, the old empires felt the tremor beneath their feet. From Paris to London, Washington to Brussels, boardrooms and ministries scrambled to respond. Africa was slipping through their fingers, and they could not accept it. First came the economic punishment. Aid suspended, assets frozen, contracts cancelled. Western companies withdrew overnight, hoping to suffocate the young governments before they could stand. Television networks flooded the airwaves with warnings of regional instability. But what they truly feared was not chaos, it was independence. Then came the psychological war. Media narratives portrayed Ibrahim Traoré and his allies as dangerous radicals. Think tanks wrote reports describing rising African authoritarianism. Social media bots whispered of coups, divisions, and foreign interference. The same tactics once used against Gaddafi were reborn, only more sophisticated, digital, and relentless. Yet something unexpected happened. The people did not believe them. They had seen the pattern too many times: Libya, Ivory Coast, Congo. They knew the script, and they refused to play their assigned role. Instead of despair, they chose defiance. Instead of isolation, they built new bridges to Russia, to China, to Brazil, to one another. Burkina Faso began trading directly in gold and grain. Mali opened its doors to African engineers. Niger started building solar farms with local resources. The old powers watched, stunned. Their former colonies were no longer pleading for help, they were helping each other. Inside the African Union headquarters, unease grew. Some older leaders whispered that the Sahel revolution was too radical. Others feared Western retaliation. But outside those marble walls, millions of Africans shouted a single demand: no more puppets, no more silence. Meanwhile, intelligence networks moved quietly. Money flowed into neighboring countries. Rumors spread of plots to destabilize the Sahel through insurgencies and sabotage. It was a replay of the Cold War, except this time, the battlefield was African soil, and the prize was African sovereignty. Ibrahim Traoré knew it. He told his people, they will try to starve us, to divide us, to bribe us, but we must never sell our dignity again. And as he spoke, across the continent, murals of Thomas Sankara began reappearing on the walls of schools, markets, and barracks. It was as if the ghosts of the revolution had returned to remind a new generation that the struggle was not yet over. The battle for Africa's future had begun not between nations, but between two ideas, dependence or destiny. And this time, the youth chose destiny. In the quiet of Ouagadougou's dawn, an old woman stands before a mural of her husband, Thomas Sankara. Her hair is silver now, but her eyes still hold the same fire that once lit the Burkinabe revolution. She touches the painted face and whispers, "They are ready now, Thomas." Her name is Mariam Sankara, and she has carried a continent's hope longer than any flag. For nearly 4 decades, she lived between exile and silence, watching Africa struggle under the weight of betrayal and foreign chains. But in recent years, something changed. Everywhere she went, she saw young faces painted with determination, from Bamako to Niamey, from Johannesburg to Khartoum. They called her Mother of Freedom, and she, in turn, called them Children of Courage. Well, when Ibrahim Traoré rose to power, he sent her a message. "Mother Mariam, your husband dreamed of a free Africa. We are ready to make it real." She smiled not out of pride, but out of relief, because at last, someone was continuing what Thomas had begun. Not the cult of personality, but the culture of responsibility. Today, Mariam's dream stretches far beyond Burkina Faso. She envisions an Africa without artificial borders, where young people can travel, trade, and study freely. An Africa with its own currency, backed not by Western banks but by its resources. An Africa defended by its own sons and daughters, not by foreign troops who speak of peace while guarding the mines. In her speeches, she says, "The revolution is not revenge. It is reconciliation between Africa and itself." Her words carry through villages and capitals alike, echoed by students, farmers, and soldiers who once felt invisible. They begin to believe that unity is not a fantasy, but a necessity for survival. And as nations across the Sahel forge alliances creating roads, trade zones, and shared defense pacts, the idea of a united Africa stops being a dream. It becomes a blueprint, a plan written not in treaties, but in blood, sweat, and conviction. Under the same African sky where Gaddafi once fell, and where Traoré now stands, the voices of 1 billion people whisper the same prayer. Never again shall our destiny be written in foreign capitals. The world watches half in admiration, half in fear, as Africa begins to rise not with war, but with self-belief. And in that rise, Mariam Sankara's legacy finds its truest form, not as a widow of revolution, but as the mother of a reborn continent. Because revolutions begin with men, but nations are rebuilt by mothers.